It's in the mail. Long distance.
Yeah, okay.
Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see such a great number of people here for our final lecture in the Caput Center's interdisciplinary colloquial series. This series started last year with President Jack Wilson, the president of the University of Massachusetts, asking or addressing the question, what is STEM education? And throughout the year, we've had a variety of speakers address the teaching and learning and the advancement of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education. And it is a great pleasure and honor to have Professor Macedo here this evening to look at these issues around technology in a very different way. So that's part of what we are trying to promote here at the Caput Center, to look at things outside the box. Next year, I want to promote the series that we are firming up as we speak. There'll be a focus on creativity and learning. So I encourage you all to make sure that you're on our list so we can communicate with you and let you know of the exciting speakers that we have lined up starting in the fall in September, crossing lots of different disciplines. Okay, so there's a new theme that we're going to be addressing. I want to introduce formally Professor Macedo's work. Bernardo is a full professor of English and a distinguished professor of liberal arts and education at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. He's a chair of the Applied Linguistics Graduate Department at the same institution. And he has published more than 100 articles and books in the areas of linguistics, critical literacy, and multicultural education. Some of his publications include Literacy, Reading, The Word and the World with Paulo Freire, Literacies of Power, which I see some of you have been reading in preparation for tonight's talk, and various other works. Bernardo has received one of the most prestigious awards in education when he was selected as a member of the laureate chapter of Kappa Delta Pi International Society in Education. Past recipients of this award include, among others, the following individuals, which I assume some of you have heard of: Albert Einstein, Walter Lippmann, Margaret Mead, Charles Skinner, and Jean Piaget. This is an international award that recognizes Bernardo Macedo's scholarly contributions over the years and the influence that his work has had in both the United States and many other countries around the world. It gives me great pleasure to formally welcome Bernardo.
Two things. I would not recommend that you follow my trajectory in publication. To do all of that cost me a marriage. So don't go there. So, price for everything. Second, it's nice to be here. It reminds me many years ago when we had money at UMass Boston. People had coffee and
other things.
I just sat in front by coincidence Diane Ravitch's recent book I debated for about 25 years ago, where we saw the world, in different directions. And I'm so happy that now she's turning around and saying that she was misguided and the system was not working after all. And I don't know so much how I should trust her, but nevertheless, one should be encouraged that we have always the possibility to change. And that's what my talk is all about today. I also don't know why I was invited. I'll find out soon. But I do think always outside the box, so I guess I fit that. And I also worked for many, many years with Paulo Freire, which I'll be talking about him a little bit. But Stephen, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to dialogue with your colleagues about, I think, issues that are cutting edge and will determine the quality of world that we're going to have in the next few decades. So, with that in mind, I want to also congratulate you that in inviting people like myself, it's clearly that you are going outside the rigidity of the curriculum, and you are daring to imagine, the democratic potential of the technological revolution. That is, in the digital age, where we are becoming more and more saturated with constantly new forms of knowledge, students need to correspondingly become independent and critical thinkers who are able to evaluate and critically analyze the text as well as its context in order to act ethically and accordingly. Since I'm here at UMass Boston, gosh, I've been there too long. Since I'm here at UMass Dartmouth, sister institution, I should be here. I would like to acknowledge two administrators who made my work possible. We cannot do anything by ourselves, even though we often lie to ourselves that we can. Both Ismael Ramirez Soto, who a friend of mine for many years, and your chancellor, Gene McCormick, who had been my vice chancellor at UMass Boston, understood that the world was changing rapidly and made sure that my Freudian inspired teacher preparation program at UMass Boston would not be undermined and would instead be in the forefront of knowledge production. I always believe that we are not just consumers of knowledge, that we should engage our colleagues, ourselves, and our students in the active knowledge production. That's what university life is all about. And I am happy, and not quoting my own, but I'm saying, in deference to these two people who helped me, I'm happy to say that our teacher preparation program is considered today one of the two best graduate programs in the College of Liberal Arts at UMass Boston, measured by all the indices that we do with all these, NCATES and other things such as publications, external funding, placement of students in doctoral programs, universities such as Harvard, McGill University, Stanford, University of Berkeley, California, University of London, among others. However, without Ismael and Gene's support, which I think was no small matter, given my close association with Paulo Freire. 20-some years ago, later, the Governor Brewer of Arizona signed a bill that bans ethnic studies and multicultural education because, according to her, these programs promote ethnic solidarity. The law was a victory for Tom Horn, the superintendent of Tucson Public Schools, who viewed ethnic studies, Africana studies, and multicultural education as to influence, as he said, by Pedagogy of the Oppressed, a book that I'm intimately tied with, written by my friend and mentor, Paulo Freire. Superintendents all over the news. You go to YouTube, you go to CNN, you go to the New York Times, you go to the LA Times, it's all over the place. And and I'm proud to be associated with him. But I will problematize what does this mean for technology in a little while. Superintendent Tom Horn argued that the ethnic program in Tucson is based on the work of Freire, who, according to him, is I quote, a well-known communist inspired by Che Guevara, unquote. In addition, he believed that students should, I quote, be taught as an individual and not as exemplars of race in which they were born into, unquote. Now let's take a minute to reflect, it's great, and he quotes Martin Luther King, that we should really pay attention to the character, to our character, and not to the color of our skin, I believe. But if you really believe that, in fact, that race does not matter, then why do we have racism? If race does not matter, why do we have ghettos? If race does not matter, why do we have poverty in this country? If race does not matter, why over 50% of students are African American students and Latino students are dropping out of all the high schools, particularly in urban areas? So in a sense, to just dismiss rather than engage, and I hope that's what we'll be doing through dialogue, you see, we need to say that we can only be treated as individuals, and we can succeed as individuals when we have already a material condition that will ascertain that we succeed as such. I.e., if you're white middle class, there are structures in place, including networks, that will make sure that as an individual will make it. But if you don't have those structures, it is very, very difficult to say, and those of us who made it out of the ghetto, we are accidents of history. The vast majority of my friends did not go to college, and they're just as smart as I am. You see? So it is this type of simple, facile discussion. But furthermore, as we will begin to see, we see that I'll come later to see how technology can in a sense even the playing field in some radical ways. We have, for instance, this type of attitude may not reproduce the ugliness that we see all over the place. Not only in the United States. We're talking about the United States because we're here. In France, it's worse, my dear. In Spain, it's really difficult. In Belgium, I can go on and on. In Italy, it is problematic to say the least. So, if the attack on Freire that began in Arizona and the laws passed to basically ban him and ban programs associated with him, and that moves to the East Coast, I'm going to have to ask Gene to bring me to you because I don't think I'm going to be able to stay at UMass Boston. But let's see what the future will offer us. Instead, then, of falling prey to a paralyzing fear and odious censorship, I believe that both Ismael and Gene relied on a tremendous capacity to conceptualize new forms of pedagogy and leadership, where educational excellence and access are never viewed as being mutually exclusive, and that standards that we often hear about all the time in the educational reform from our governor to our president and everybody else, and standards and critical thinking should be the twin skin of any democratic education. You see, standards without access is standardless because it only produces education for one type of folks, and I don't think that's democratic in any way, shape, or form. So. Then for this reason, it is for this reason that both, I think, Ismael and Gene are constantly urging the university to respond to the pressing social challenges of our ever-changing society. It's rapidly changing, and with the advent of technology, we can't even keep pace with it. As with all agents of change, both Ismael and Gene never view the present as past, and reject a process that recoils in any attempt to maintain the status quo, because status quo is never really maintained. It changes, it moves. Those moves are imperceptible, but nevertheless they are moving. But those moves, the imperceptible moves, tend to really reward certain groups of people who have heavily invested in the status quo, and against basically the well-being of the vast majority of people who happen not to be part of the status quo. Unfortunately, in a democracy, we still have to talk and struggle with these issues. Rather, Ismael and Gene, I believe, would embrace a critical dialogical approach, which I'm going to propose, and also that my colleague, I don't want to mispronounce your name.
I don't know how to pronounce it.
Say it. Hedges and Moreno, a paper that I read, a number of papers that I read, but this one that I read last week, who urge educators to seize upon change and view, and I quote, the new potential impact of classroom connectivity with meaningful participatory frameworks that guide curriculum design to analyze motivation and learning, unquote. This is what it's at. It's not about teaching students to the test so they can pass MCAS, or so we can close down schools. I am happy to be part of the conversation to close down schools, so long in the conversation we are also to close down poverty. If we can't close down poverty, closing down schools is basically a diversion for the real issue. Because we know those students who are failing are students who are poor, are students who come from a lower class, background, are students who happen to be non-mainstream, whatever that means, are students who are Latinos, are students who are blacks, and young poor women, by and large. So, I believe what I really got from the paper, both Hegedus and Moreno, critically understand that for education to be meaningful, it must always be relevant. You take relevancy outside of education, you have what Paulo calls blah, blah, blah. And some people are very good in blah, blah, blah. They pass the test, and so on and so forth. What I mean by that, a good friend of mine, Jim G., who used to teach at USC, he had the honors class, as well as he had, a scholarship student program. And what happened in the honors class, he would give them, the SATs. And these students would get 100% right without even reading the questions. Because as part of the cultural capital, they knew exactly, one, art is universal. Even though most people, including their parents, no longer think that is the case. But they all say it's universal. Because this is the myth that we have been inculcated with our education. That's what we talk about in the conversation, so on and so forth. And then when he gave the same tests to scholarship kids, these are kids that did very well but come from a background not provided with the middle class, cultural capital, invariably they did poorly. Even though they were scholarship kids, they were, in the same university. So in a sense then, level playing field, even within the curriculum, to think that's there, is to basically engage in the pedagogy of life, which I hope to develop a little bit later. So to make then education relevant, according to Hegedus and Moreno, they would have to understand that the traditional banking model called for by MCAS, for example, shrink the possibilities of critical dialogue where, according to them, I quote, strong renegotiation must occur between the interpreter and the interpreter, unquote. Thus, Hegedus and Moreno embrace, in my view, a Freirean model of education that view, I quote, according to Freire, men and women as being capable of evaluating, of intervening, of choosing, of deciding, and also of breaking away. Reasons why we have made ourselves into ethical beings, thus opening the tragic possibility of transgression against ethics itself, unquote. We could take this little, passage by Freire and apply it to this draconian law in Arizona, or we could apply it, for instance, the type of police profiling that's happening all over the place. We see how, while upholding or paying lip service to morality or ethics, the same individuals are constantly engaging in the violation, transgression of the ideals that they proclaim to be upholding at some level. Many people that do crazy things, they go to mass every Sunday. And these are the type of the contradictions, the type of engagement of the pedagogy of the obvious, so can get them to see their own contradiction. We all have them. We all cut across by contradiction. I think it's part of the education process is to own up to our contradiction, so to be able then to move away, or at least to reconcile them, at least to find a way that these contradictions do not impede about the freedom or the wishes, the aspiration, and the dreams of others. In other words, then, the wholesale promotion of democracy for all that we have, the Pledge of Allegiance seemingly does that, even though I saw you some of the book, Davis Plichter, in refusing to say so, he was about to be expelled from Boston Latin, and well, good that he did. He gave me a book, and so what I was trying to say is that in the wholesale promotion of democracy for all, including those who want to promote ethnic studies, is it ethical to curtail selected democratic practices when these practices don't line up to our liking? I.e., for example, I may not like ethnic studies, I may not like Africana studies, I may not like the teaching of evolution, I may not like teaching creationism, but in a democracy that's precisely what it is. It's unruly. I have to at least respect and engage in the dialogue with those who disagree with me, because if I don't do that, and I think that's what Stephen is trying to do, in his program, if I don't do that, there's no possibility for what one could call co-creation, co-growth, and co-liberation. Liberation not in terms that you're free to move around, but liberation of the mind, the heart, and the spirit. So we don't come into this table, to this organization, to this gathering, already with predisposed notion, I'm not going to like him. I haven't had the chance to know, even if he says crazy things that, may offend me, I have to understand that he is a byproduct of a social construction. So if I understand the victimhood in that social construction, then I'm able, at some level, to transcend and to try to connect at the level of humanity as much as we can do. That doesn't mean we don't get mad or don't get angry. That's beside the point. So hence, it is always important to understand the linkage between the goals of a society that prides itself in the freedom of expression and the censorship of certain types of expression that are not, in line with our liking. Thus, the governor of Arizona callously signed a law into a bill that closed down ethnic studies in her state while remaining totally silent, she was asked about it, about other ethnic studies, such as Irish studies. It's an ethnic group, my friends. And I love Jean is Irish. I grew up in an Irish neighborhood. My sister-in-law, I'm surrounded by Irish people. That's not the issue. But think about proposing that you close down the Irish study at Notre Dame University. And they are known throughout the world for their Irish studies. You see? And yet, it's okay to close down the Latino ethnic studies at Tucson. So if we cannot see the contradiction, that's what I'm saying. This is the pedagogy of the audience. You see? And I can even go further, a lot of women here. Think about, with all the struggle during the 60s, to basically, ascertain that women have a space. So they would then investigate, evaluate, decide, think, recapture their history, understand the oppression, understand patriarchy, and then, if you follow this line of the argument, we close down women's studies too. What we end up with? Patriarchy and white supremacy, as it had been before. See? So in a sense, the backlash, and this is how I think that we can move very quickly, with the aid of the new tools that we are available to us, to make sure, and I'll share to you what I mean by that in a minute, to make sure that that does not happen. And I know that we are better than that we will transcend. That is, ethnic studies in this sense, in Arizona, is framed as a code word, which is part of a process through which ethnic is thus associated with Latinos, in this case, it's from majority Latinos. By the way, that land, if we really push, used to belong to them. The Latinos associated with Latino, whereas Irish ethnicity now, not always, but now, is subsumed under whiteness, which in turn is made invisible. However, the very invisibility of whiteness serves always as the benchmark against which we measure all other groups. So we don't, let me see how it plays out. I'm a linguist by training, how it plays out in language. People, can I pick on you? Okay? How would you describe yourself? A person of color, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, and we all do that. I write and I have no other choice. I have to end up looking for choice that would be politically correct. I end up with a person of color. Now, if he basically says he's a person of color, I'm a person of color, then, what's your color?
White.
Right, okay. Thank you. Don't be tongue-tied. No, white. So that means it creates what's called in linguistics a semantic impossibility. You cannot have colorless white. You see? So then color, you see how language plays these games with us, that through these games you produce an ideology. Then color, in a sense, refers not to the color of your skin. It typecasts you ethnically or racially in order to devalue. It has no other value. Even medicine, there's all kinds of investigations, with exception of very rare cases. At the end of the day, our DNA is not really too dissimilar. But nevertheless, but extremely important socially, it's extremely important ethnically, and it's extremely important racially in a highly racist society. So therefore, if these things are extremely important, don't create a law that you say you cannot study these things. Because the more ignorance you breed, the more in trouble the society will be, for sure. So then, what I wanted to go, what we need to do, I think, both event, whatever event may be, i.e. the passage of the law in California, and the actors of that event, i.e. the superintendent and the governor, okay, are always engaged, whether they admit it or not, in dialectical relationships that involve both action and reaction. And as Regidus and Moreno took it a step further, they call it as co-action and co-reaction. It's extremely important, and I'll see if I can make sense of it in a minute within the Frege model. Does the co-action and co-reaction necessarily requires a dialogical space? You have to have a dialogical space. Without dialogue, you're teaching vertically, not horizontally. You're teaching according to a particular curriculum. You're teaching to the test. You're not teaching to create independent critical minds, because you're not. We wouldn't have this dialogue to know that he feels white and I feel non-white, and then where we're going to go with that. You see what I'm saying? So then the dialogical phase must be guided always by critical analysis, tolerance of multiple viewpoints, and in all liberatory processes, in all democratic experiments, ultimately a responsibility of our actions. At the end of the day, we have to be responsible for what we do, and if we don't do that, and that is guided in turn by our ethical posture in the world. If one is complicit, as many people who have come out to support the law in Arizona, complicit with that, it seems to me that they have, in a sense, create a space that their ethics can be now interrogated, and because you can't, on one hand, deny some people what you will not allow to be happening to you. In other words, it's important to study one's history, it's important to speak one's language, it's important to celebrate one's culture, it's important to be. You cannot have a democracy that in order to be, you have to stop being. You see, it's impossible. Those things are contradiction in terms, and that's what a dialogical model, I think, will do. And I say in my presentation, what I have written, is that I want also today to dialogue with you in order to celebrate dialogue as an instructional tool in the classroom. But I also want to highlight the importance of our current technology connectivity with other public spheres that, more than education, guide and shape our evolving democracy. I say evolving between quotation, to the extent that democracy everywhere is not a static state that is achieved, but a process for which we must always struggle and for which we must always remain vigilant. What I mean by that, we had the civil rights movement, we had all kinds of rights for women, blacks, Chicanos, and so on and so forth. On one hand, right now we are experiencing a backlash that little by little all these rights are being taken back. So if we don't remain vigilant, we would find ourselves, in pre-1960s, the 1950s. No question in my mind about that. And you see it how? You see it, for instance, in scholarship. And you see in the so-called doing away with quotas. We see in so-called you cannot have special programs. We see in seemingly integration that while integrating, maintains segregation. And I will develop these points in a little while. And I said we have to remain vigilant because keep in mind that Hitler did not take over power via coup d'etat. He was elected democratically. You see? So because he was elected democratically, we can also have the potential, all society, have the capacity to elect, future Hitlers. And what we want to do is to act creatively and critically to make sure that that does not happen. So then we take our voting system very seriously. Then while we generally hold the view that we cannot conceive democracy unless the media are totally free and independent, here comes the internet. It is important that citizens of a free society understand how the nexus between government, corporation, and the media often produce a manufacture of consent, as Chomsky calls it, designed to undermine the very objectivity posture claimed by members of the media and educators as well. We all talk about objectivity, we all talk about we cannot be subjective, but we don't realize for each claim of subjectivity already embedded, in that claim, there's a dose of, in each claim of objectivity already embedded in that claim, there's a dose of subjectivity. Thus the two are always in a dialectic relationship. So every time you tell me, I'm only doing this because I want to be objective, that claim already, subsumes subjectivity. I.e., and I'll share with you in a minute, when New York Times decide to have a title of a story, even though it may present that story as objective, but somebody chose it. Somebody chose that story over another story. And that choosing already is subjective. So let's go on to see that what I wanted them to discuss with you is how objectivity is too often undermined by the new technologies that we come up every day, and the reliance on sound bites, for example, cliches, and even tweets, which in turn feed to the public dominant values that are sometimes contrary to the very interests of the majority of the people, in our society. I will also argue that the understanding of the government media nexus in the manufacture of consent requires new forms of literacy, not the traditional literacy that we have had, to produce individuals with conviction, with a clear ethical posture, courage to speak to power, and a willingness to change, all of which, according to Paulo Freire, cannot be disconnected from ethical principles that should always guide and shape our struggle for a more democratic and less dehumanizing world. In 1966, I visited Guinea-Bissau, and in a conversation with the former Minister of Finances, Maneca Santos, he insightfully shared with a group of colleagues, educators and politicians, his concern that one cannot conceive of democracy without a totally free, independent media. A few days after that remark, by almost ironic, the enormously fragile democracy of Guinea-Bissau became to an abrupt end via a coup d'etat that plagues most democratic aspiration in all those African countries who want to emerge from the yoke of colonialism and dictatorship. The rebel group that successfully put an end to all democratic hopes and aspirations in Guinea-Bissau understood precisely too well that their success rested not only in the supremacy of the military power, but also the manipulation of the mass public imagination by means of control. This is in line, according to Walt Whitman, that the bewildered herd, those that consume the media, that goes throughout, parties and select delegations and so on and so forth. There goes those who vote, need, according to him, need to be subjugated to their proper role, a role that they should be nothing more, nothing less than spectators, and not participate in action. I.e., what he means by that, every 4 years we vote. But once we vote, we have no control what happens. And if you don't believe me, how much control did any of us here in the room have in deciding, how the financial institutions and banks are going to be dealt with? The vast majority of people did not agree with it, but the bottom line is trillions of dollars went to the very bank that created the problem to begin with. So the only thing that we can do 4 years later, we may try to, what they use, the cliche, we may try to throw the bombs out. And then again, we bring a new set of bombs. So it is if we remain uncritical. Okay? So it is for this reason then that the rebel forces Guinea-Bissau immediately seized control of an important radio station. In a short few days, they secured the support of so-called bewildered herd. The sudden shift of massive support from one form of government to another reflects the inherent disarticulation between those in control of power and the masses, a control maintained through propaganda apparatuses that we see identified very clearly when you talk about Cuba, when we talk about the Soviet Union, but we don't see it in the United States because we have bought into the myth that we don't have that. And also a type of manufacturing of consent to the extent that, I quote, the common interests elude public opinion entirely and can only be understood and managed by a specialized class of responsible men who are smart enough to figure out things, unquote. Now, Chomsky. In fact, for saying things like this, he was not allowed to cross the border in Israel, so he had to come back. There's a price for the things that we do. But nevertheless, I think it's important to think outside the box, to see how we as educators, teachers, anybody that works for social justice or for democracy need to understand how we can so easily be manipulated, and sometimes it's not our fault. So the more critical we become, the more we basically lessen the space where manipulation can occur, with impunity. So basically, then, what I want to do is that if we believe that the propaganda apparatus that functioned very well in the Soviet Union, that functioned very well in other countries that we basically critique, and rightly so, the degree that people are willing to engage in the construction, what I call not seeing, so they blindly engage in the construction of not seeing, by ignoring already highly feeble democratic institutions and the unjust asymmetric power relations that characterize the hypocritical nature of most contemporary democracies, not in the United States, but all over Europe. The inherent hypocrisy in the actual use of the term democracy is insightfully captured by Noam Chomsky in his analysis, for example, of the United States. He said, democracy in the United States, I quote, rhetoric refers to a system of governance in which elite elements based in the business community control the state by virtue of their dominance of the private society, and while the population observes quietly. What does he mean by that? All the lobbyists, all of the money, all of the millions of dollars that's given to a candidate, there's no way that a candidate is independent to be able to make decisions. And we know it. In fact, when Obama began to be a little bit more energetic to criticize Wall Street, the business community, says, wait a minute, this got to stop, because then what happens? The money stopped flowing to the Democratic Party. It began flowing to the Republican Party. So these are structures that are in place. So democracy then is highly controlled. And that being the case, then we need to understand what we're going to do about it. But we cannot fool ourselves that by pledging, by saying the Pledge of Allegiance, then we are doing our part, because it's much more complex than that. So then the process of overcoming what he calls a crisis of democracy is not easy. But it is something for which we should struggle in order to participate in the creation of a less discriminatory and more humane world. I believe that this struggle is enormously more viable now with the advent of technology, as we saw with the impact that MoveOn.org had on the last presidential election. There's no way that Obama would have been elected without that massive reorganization of organizations like MoveOn.org, or the youth on campus all over the place that begin to imagine otherwise. Without technology, I'm not so sure. I may be wrong, but it would have been extremely difficult to win that race. So because the digital age has saturated us with information, continues to saturate with information that we couldn't possibly, make sense of, without, critical tools, it is, in my view, that much more imperative that we avoid a new form of illiteracy that's happening right before our own eyes, not only in the United States, but all over the world, where a particular form of information remains disconnected from other bodies of knowledge, and we remain unable to relate the flux of information so as to gain a critical reading of the world. A critical reading of the world implies, according to Freire, I quote, a dynamic comprehension between the least coherent sensibility of the world with a more coherent understanding of that very world, unquote. This is exemplified, for example, by Regis and Moreno's work, I quote, where user-learner not only guides an environment, in other words, you're a subject, you're not an object, you see, say software. So software does not control you, or you're interacting, you're a subject it should not be your subject, you see. In fact, it should be the object, a tool to facilitate your subjectivity, you see, in which their action on it, you see, but it is guided by the environment through the resultant dynamic fluid reaction, unquote. So this implies dialectical relation and understanding of dialectical relations. This is totally innovative, totally outside the box, totally what's not happening in most classrooms. All you do, I invite you, go visit. You see, particularly in poor neighborhoods, that teachers spend most of their days training students, even after school, to pass the MCAT, so they have good score, so their schools will not be labeled underperforming schools. Okay? With the potential then that the age of technology offers to democratize the world and our relations within it, we can often easily find ourselves more enslaved by the propaganda apparatus if we are not able to make linkage between bodies of knowledge and the social political realities that generate them. Okay? Hence, Freire's proposed dialogical model recognized that a coherent comprehension of the world cannot be achieved through the fragmentation of knowledge as practiced by teaching to the test model, for example. That is, how can we explain that even those Americans who are uninsured and those who are on Medicare did not support the health care bill? How can we explain the reaction of a Medicare recipient, an older woman, who makes a public announcement that she is against the health care bill because she does not want her government to become socialist and run her health care? This is a woman on Medicare. Why was it that while we have available ample positive empirical evidence supporting universal health care in most developed nations, Norway, Sweden, Holland, Canada, etc., millions, 46 million Americans could simply ignore that evidence as they champion against what Sarah Palin, labeled as death panels. So all you have to do is hear death panels. I tweet it before you know you have 3,000 people in an event, in a rally. You see what I'm saying? because there's no connection between what that means and people's aspiration, needs, and so on and so forth. In other words, our challenge is how can we use available technology to show how empty slogans such as death panels, in our bill that was proposed in the House not too long ago, a transgender bill that was immediately labeled bathroom bill, you see what I'm saying? And that people that don't think, don't make the connection, they just go with the flow. You see? What I'm saying is, in a democracy, we need to go beyond empty slogans and cliches to know that bathroom bill, is a manipulation, or that panels is also a manipulation that will ultimately work against us. What I mean by that, I found this woman that didn't want, even though she was Medicare, I read 2 days ago in Patriot Ledger, a newspaper in the South Shore, that they had in Weymouth, Massachusetts, a free dental clinic all Sunday that doctors offer. There was this elderly that was about to take with pliers 5 teeth because he was so much in pain, and he said had not been for the free clinic, he would. There were lines, people that would drive to the parking lot at 1 o'clock in the morning to make sure they had dental care. And maybe many of these people would vote against universal health care. So it's how you begin to, this is how hegemony works. You begin to work against your own interest. And within that group, the doctor was very proud of himself. He says, I was so happy that I was able to take care of 3 veterans. Think about that. We go, you put your penny on the line, and you come back to society that can't even provide you with dental care or health care. So, and then that doctor was not able to make the linkage. She was just happy that he was able to do something, and good for him. This compassion, this empathy. But he didn't have to, exhibit his generosity or his compassion, sometimes a false generosity, if we all had access to health care. So then, for me, the challenge is how we can use available technology to show how empty slogans and cliches such as death panels anesthetize consciousness, without which we can never develop clarity of reality. The apprehension of clarity requires a higher level of political clarity, which can be achieved by sifting through a flux of information and relating each piece with one another so as to gain a global comprehension of the facts and their raison d'etre. In other words, I want to basically sit down with this veteran and say, I really admire you, I admire your courage, I am very, very, grateful for you putting your life on the line, for this country to keep our freedom, so on and so forth. But I want to have a dialogue with you. Aren't you upset and pissed that you come back, you have no job, you're homeless, and you don't have dental care, you don't have access to health care? And then to see what comes out, you see? And now, if I ignore, I engage in obliviousness, I pretend it does not exist, then what I am, I'm contributing, you see, to the crisis of democracy that Chomsky is talking about. This very woman that argued against health care because of that panel, then said that she was in Medicare, and she was very happy with it, not realizing that Medicare is already a government program. You see? So the level of stupefaction that occurs, or misinformation, is something that in a highly developed, economy or democracy cannot be tolerated, because it constitutes a form of illiteracy, political literacy, and political literacy can be more dangerous than not being able to read and write in many respects. So I want to move to a little bit, and the reason she gave is because, she doesn't want her government or her healthcare to become socialistic, which means socialism become a sign, as you talk about in your paper, in terms of sign, which connotes it with negative and then rejected, because it's highly manipulated and it plays a role, language plays a role in this process. I just did, for 3 months an analysis of the New York Times, and to see what is the context that will enable us to just use the shock word socialism, and people immediately have this negative feeling. Cannot be tolerated. This negative feeling is that it is a totalitarian government, it has no freedom, you don't have the free enterprise, and so on and so forth. I don't want it, even though I ain't going to participate ever, in the goodies of that system. but that doesn't matter. I will continue to support that. So basically, I look at the New York Times for 3 months, and that's what I found with respect to leaders, that we don't support. Lula da Silva, number one. Lula da Silva, New York says, Lula da Silva of the left-wing Works Party in Brazil. So Lula da Silva has to be qualified always. It is a leftist leader. Immediately you say that, or you call him socialist, then we can dismiss. But in order to dismiss, I have to have a context that has already been ideologically predisposed for me to trigger the little movies, whatever I think about socialism, and what I think about socialism by them, the slogan is not good, is negative. Even though Norway, Sweden, all of these countries that have higher indices of quality of life, they are socialists, but we don't talk about that. Then 2 says, Lula da Silva of the Leftist Works Party. 3, a leftist candidate, Lula da Silva. 4, ex-leftist in the center Brazil votes. 5, El Comandante, Hugo Chavez, which is an indirect association with El Comandante Fidel Castro, because that's how it's called in Cuba. Okay? Then 5, this is 3 months. Okay? You can do it yourself here. 6, Mr. Chavez, New York Times, is a blustering populist, or worse, a dangerous ideologue who styles himself, as the 21st century Fidel Castro, unquote. 7, Mr. Evo Morales of Bolivia gave the kind of leftist speech that increasingly strikes a chord with Latin American disenchanted voters, unquote. They never ask why voters are disenchanted. But so it begins to create that context. So this poor woman has no other choice. If say socialist, I don't want to associate with these bums, because that's the movie that she has. Now let's look how we treat countries that are just as totalitarian, if not worse, and how the New York Times, free media, treats it. First, Felipe Calderón of Mexico, the former minister with a Harvard degree, who talks of fitting Mexico into a globalized economy, as contrasted in the same text with, I quote, Mr. Felipe López Obrador, who leads the leftist party of the Democratic Revolution. Do you see how the game is played? So if we then have students in a classroom that we just let these things go unexamined, guess what? It's not their fault. They begin to believe that, Obrador, Lula and those people are no good, and then basically you have also this cultural cachet, Harvard graduate, Minister of Energy, and so on and so forth, a technocrat, somebody who's going to be, doing, great things for the economy in Mexico. And if you go to Mexico, you know that it's not happening, because if it was happening, then you wouldn't have the so-called illegals that you have to create a law to stop them from coming. Okay? So it's the second one, Mr. Uribe from Colombia, 49 years old. This is quotes from New Yorker, a former governor who has completed courses at Harvard and Oxford, unquote. So you see, I'm just proposing. So what I do in my class, I don't have to say anything. I don't have to lecture. I don't have to indoctrinate. All I do is I just propose. And that's great when you do it. Technology facilitates, because I have everything online. Students have to see, and the contrast, then they have to begin to engage in a dialogue and then to make up their own mind. If they think this is fair, then we can still have another dialogue until we come to some resolution that this bias, even though we claim the New York Times. 3, Mr. Uribe, 49, who in 26 years of public life worried about paving roads and balancing budgets, unquote. Compare this how Lula, Evo, and Chavez were presented, Then Mr. Uribe, and then sometimes they don't say leftist, but it's okay to say a hardliner, okay, elected in Colombia with a mandate to crush the rebels. The rebels already calls, for the context that they need to be crushed because they are violating, civil rights of other people. 5, President Uribe, we never say that about Lula, the leftist Lula, okay, soft and stone regarding cracking down on leftist guerrillas, you see. 6, Pakistani leader, President Musharraf, hits political bump. General Musharraf has succeeded in creating an opponent. My friends, let's look at this. The very association with terms, sharp words, immediately shows that there's no freedom or no objectivity the way New York Times is presenting, the facts. You see, why is it that we don't say, the right wing Uribe, who is associated, with the militia group, that has killed thousands and thousands and thousands of innocent people, but that will never be found. But we will find that, for instance, if Evo Morales engaged in that behavior. You see? So it's not a question of what I believe in Evo Morales or what I believe in Lula. It is irrelevant what I believe. It's the question that if I go toward the fight for democracy, I think I am basically, duped into a big lie, thinking that the New York Times is telling me the truth. If you do that, I just do this exercise, I did it, this weekend, so I can present something to you so we can discuss. Now, how then can we then bring technology? One, through technology, I will immediately got the information. That's number one, you see. Second, to technology, I can be connected all over the place, even with kids in Venezuela, in, Pakistan, all over the place to have this discussion. So my classroom is not here, it can be expanded. So these are but the type of pluses, but I'll come to the essence of it in a minute. But we cannot have success through technology unless we understand how sharp words, i.e. leftist, socialist, communist, Marxist, versus Harvard-educated, Oxford-educated, play to create little movies for us, and then we unreflectively sometimes embrace that little movie, and we have no other choice as spectators to act when called upon to act. So we are, in a sense, like an automaton. Then I trigger this button, you do the dance. I'm exaggerating just to make a point, but that's basically what's really happening. So then these sharp words, can be tweeted. Then if I tweet, there's no space for analysis in that tweet. So whatever I have believed already, in other words, that I have ideologically been inculcated with the Smiths and believe, that's basically what I am going to believe. Then what I'm trying to say then, while a tweet is highly informative, it can also hide a great deal, and by the same token, if we rely only on it, and we don't create conditions for critical literacy, where critical independent thinking is the focus of the work that we do, then I cannot make sense when I see death panels. You see, I cannot make sense when I see that from Bill, because it has to do with my ideology, and if my ideology is in line with the tweet, then I'm okay. If it's not, I just dismiss. And then there's no space to do that. Then I'm going to give you and end with this. We have another, these terms, expression, and words that I call, that's called, sharp words. They can either have positive or negative associations, almost independent of their meanings. So, that panel is whatever you believe is what's going to determine whether it's going to be so positively associated or negatively associated. For example, the term welfare will almost always associated with socialism in this country, which in turn is ideologically structured to conjure lack of freedom, totalitarian governments, and a retreat from a value that views people as individuals who are not beholden by a collective. The superintendent of Tucson schools made that point. If he doesn't want to ethnic studies, because teaching solidarity is denying individuals the right to be individual. But we can teach Irish studies, but that's okay. That's the type of collectivity that we don't mind, you see? So these are the type of contradictions that I think need to be interrogated. Thus, for example, the liberal president, Bill Clinton, so I don't criticize just Bush, probably put an end to welfare as we know it. He was very proud of that, That's part of his legacy. In a crusade to end what he called then the handouts. a shock word that is almost associated with the undeserving poor who were portrayed under President Reagan as, quote, Cadillac queens or welfare queens, living off our hard-earned tax dollars. The ideological straitjacketing inherent in Hands Out brooks no space for analysis concerning the needs of empathy, compassion, that should be built in safety nets in our democratic society. Neither is it possible to discuss the human tragedy generated by poverty and the consequent human misery bred by chronic hunger, chronic poverty, and chronic violence. While Handout is viscerally understood as part and parcel of a socialist order that needs to be aggressively denounced, as Bill did, Reagan did, okay? The bailout that we've been hearing about for the past year that transferred trillions of our tax dollars to banks and financial institutions were treated by the government as a necessary moderate step that need to be taken to prevent a worse financial catastrophe that could have led us to a 1930s-style depression. While there was some opposition to the bailout, there were groups that opposed that, of banks, bailout of banks, the general consensus of most politicians in Washington, and the media in particular, was that it prevent a worse economic meltdown, we have no proof of that, by keeping the credit system fluid, even though the very banks that receive billions and billions of dollars refuse to give credit, and thus you have all this foreclosure all over the place, okay? And small business closing down, all you have to go to New Bedford downtown, you know what I'm talking about, all the stores that no longer there. No debate about socialism of the rich or for the rich was necessary or allowed. That is, bailout is nothing more or nothing less than socialism of risks for banks that are too big to fail, while profits that these banks made with the bailouts remain privatized. You see, this is what it is. We may disagree, but we can have a discussion about that. All have to be done is to invoke the great job that bankers were doing saving us from the worst financial cows, even though these same bankers that created the cows to begin with. But we are not able to make that linkage by and large. Does bailout produce a positive effect, whereas handout produces a negative effect? Handout we associate with poor, welfare. Bailout we associate with people who are taking care of our well-being, the economy, and making us the #1 economy in the world. You know? Given the manipulation then of language, we have to understand how this language then can then play a role in the use and dissemination of technology. You can't have technology without language. They are interdependent, and we need to understand that the language that flows through technology cannot be the language that I just critiqued. So it has to be a language that at least we are aware the language that we use, to not allow the very language that we use for technology for democratization to basically betray our position in our aspiration for a more democratic society. Let me end, and we'll have a discussion, by proposing, along what Stephen did, that technology offers us a pedagogy of hope that narrows the widening gap between our proclaimed ideals of democracy and our practice of these very ideals. In other words, it can prevent the contradictions that I've been discussing with you so far. By maximizing democratic potentials of technology, we can expand our capacities for critical dialogue, a process that must be informed by tolerance, respect, and solidarity. This technology cannot just be a tool, a machine. You see, we have, even when they are tools and machines, our use of the technology must be humanized, because ultimately they have an impact, either positive or negative, on human beings. You see, and we wanted to make sure that the impact is humane, not inhumane. You see, a critical dialogical approach to technology pedagogy along with Prejudice and Moreno proposed, and also Freire, must reject the social construction of connectivity that dehumanizes the other. A critical dialogical pedagogy should also point that in our construction of the other, we become intimately tied with the other. So every time I dehumanize someone, João for example, the very fact that I have the capacity to violate my ethics to dehumanize him, I have engaged in a form of my own dehumanization. And that's the type of dialogical thinking, dialogical and dialectical thinking that in a sense that, keeps us, from falling into, a pedagogy of not seeing. In short, the insertion of critical dialogue in the use of technology implies, in my view, necessarily a critical reading of the world, and, according to Freire, requires, I quote, the exercise of curiosity and its ability to challenge in order to know how to defend oneself from the traps that ideologies will place along the way, unquote. Whatever ideology, but nevertheless, we cannot do anything in life without taking a detour to ideology. So the negation of ideology or the dismissal of ideology constitute already an ideological act. So you can only kill ideology ideologically. A critical dialogical approach then will invariably use technological tools, this is a tool, to bring the world into the classroom via the deconstruction of multiple media in order to be able to reconstruct these same multiple media in a more humanized way. Since the media represent a mechanism for ideological control, not only here, all over the world, educators need to understand that the popular press and mass media educate more people about issues related to our society and the world than all other sources of education, including the current teaching for the test. By shining the mass media, for example, educators are missing the obvious. More public education is carried out by the media than teachers, professors, or anyone else, particularly in the rapidly changing technological world. For instance, my son can go to a class, he's 15 years old, you see, he can be engaged in the subject matter in an instant. He will have the answer what the teachers spent a weekend trying to teach him. So that availability and the instantaneous, ability to acquire and to access that information can then bring the world into our classroom, on one hand, as we can also bring to the classroom to the world, then you engage in multiple dialogues with multiple spheres, so the sphere is no longer classroom, and we remain afraid to even jump the fence because we want to stay safe in that context. So in the end then, whatever we do as educators, in my view, or we do as citizens, or as business people, for that matter, we must always be relevant in what we do, so as to be meaningful, and we must always struggle for a world that is more harmonious, more humane, less discriminatory and less dehumanizing, and more just. To do otherwise, in my view, is to preserve the current disorder that, according to Jean-Paul Sartre, a very famous French philosopher, I quote, sanctions misery, chronic hunger, ignorance, and in general, subhumanity. In essence, educators who refuse to use technology to transform the ugliness of human misery that witness throughout the world, social injustice and inequalities, invariably become educators who, as Sartre so painfully wrote, I quote, will change nothing, will serve no one, but will succeed only in finding moral malaise, moral comfort in malaise, unquote. Gracias.
So we have time for some questions, comments, reflections. That's it. You're done.
I can't believe I made it. Go ahead. Yeah.
I've struggled with the same kind of stuff you've struggled with for the last 20 years in sort of trying to raise a civic engagement in this region. And I know something of Gene's interest in trying to establish it at the within the university context. And I know a lot of her struggle with the bureaucracies that prevent that. My conclusion, I have a comment, not a question. I have a question, but it has to do with how you get away from the question. We'll raise the question if we can buy the alternative perspective. My sense is that all you're doing is perpetuating a discussion that basically has gone on since the axial shift. That ever since we started to develop an ethic between man and man, somewhere 900, 700 BC, with the ethical codes, that we have lived within this architecture of slavery and freedom, and it goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And my experience as a citizen is that the plutocracy of interests that now control Washington have no interest in your doing anything but continuing to deliberate and until you exhaust yourself and end up with Sartre's malaise. They have a vested interest in doing that, and in essence, it's a cultural purge similar to Mao's, as violent to ideas, just not as violent to people. I don't know how you break out of that by staying within it and having the debate. So the way I transcend that in my own thought is that we now are, and I understand the possibilities of technology for trying to resolve that. As a matter of fact, I spend most of my volunteer time supporting a dialogical technology that I think has tremendous potential for getting at the kinds of things you're talking about. But it strikes me that if you stay within the metaphysics of slavery and freedom, you can't develop a transcendent ethic other than the ethics that already exist within it: more freedom, more humanity, and so forth and so on. But sustainability, this juncture that we're at in history, and you can comment on this if you want to. This junction that we're at in history in terms of exhausting the carrying capacities of the planet now impose on us an ethical imperative that transcends the metaphysics of history, of slavery and freedom, and requires that we have an ethical imperative that basically goes to life and death. And that's the way that's what keeps me going beyond the malaise of being ignored by those who are in power. And I am ignored by people who are in power. I press at their doorbells all the time and I get ignored.
So would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Craig Lindell. I'm a business guy in town.
You said some important things. Part of the problem is to basically, precisely what you said, to transcend false dichotomies. And I think I'm enormously underdeveloped technologically, but I do a lot of thinking about that. It seems to me that, and you read right on the money, even though we represent about 5% of the world's population, we consume over 25% of the energy. And in fact, I don't want to go there, but I'll say, in 1961, Fidel Castro gave a lecture in the United Nations that, very few people know, but the technology you can just Google it, you can get it. And what he made the same, he raised the same concern. If the idea for quality of life in the world, if everybody to have 2 or 3 cars, 2 or 3 refrigerators, a kitchen downstairs, a kitchen in the middle, a kitchen in your bedroom, like Bach, that's had 14 master vineyard because he won a kitchen on the third floor, so he doesn't have to go downstairs at night. And what happens if we, billions of people, all have that, this world will implode. It's impossible to sustain. The challenge for us as educators, one, is to acknowledge that we have these problems, to acknowledge that in fact that we are involved in all sorts of manipulation, and to really understand that not always the leaders that we really elect are basically working on our behalf. So if you have a conscience as an ethical being, and I think we all, I don't think we have we're born with unethical genes. I think through social construction we become unethical. Because we can become unethical, we also can become ethical. But think about this, and I have done a lot of thinking and research about this. How many of you who are educators, in fact, business is way ahead of us, were required to take a course on ethics? You're required to take a course on testing, you're required to take a course on lesson planning, you're required to take a course, for instance, curriculum development, you're required to do everything, but ethics is not required. Even Harvard, about 20 years ago, a multimillionaire offered $20 million gift to establish such course on ethics. Harvard refused. After the bad publicity, then they took it. So they are way ahead of education. Our college education, I don't know what yours here, we don't require, a curriculum that's ethics. But I think that's where we need to begin. What I do, basically what I engage, the writing that I do in thinking, is that I have to avoid, along the lines what Freire would advise as well, is falling into malaise, cynicism, and fatalism. Because once you fall into that, they have won. You have surrendered. And I ain't going to surrender, because as a subject of the world, I understand that I can participate in that world. You see? And, I can use my life history. I came here, as a young man, not speaking English, living in Dorchester, facing all kinds of discrimination. My guidance counselor told me that I didn't have enough English to go to college, so I should become a TV repairman. I'd be rich today, pay my bills. But I didn't come here to fix your TV. I came here to do what I'm doing with you. So therefore, here I am, a full professor of English, even though with an accent. It doesn't really matter. The key is, but my colleagues who don't agree with me remind me of that always, too. Even though they come to me for me to edit their papers. But that's another issue. So these are the type of contradictions that what I do, I don't allow, I have to engage that we have the capacity to transcend, the word that you use, and I like it. And that transcendence cannot occur without awareness of the very boxification of false dichotomies. What I'm trying to say is, I think if I read his work carefully, if I understood it, he is proposing, along with Freire, possibilities of alternative spaces of pedagogical encounters that people can begin to analyze critically, the type of boxification, so as to begin to then move themselves outside that box. And plainly, he said it brilliantly, I'll have the very plain language, he says, Donaldo, you have to always have 1 foot in and 1 foot out. I am 1 foot in because I'm here with you. I am a professor at UMass Boston. I work with students, you see. A foot out is because I'm daring myself to license myself to think outside the box so we can have this conversation. But if I have to put 2 feet in, then I'm done. I would have no other choice but malaise. And 2 feet out, I'm irrelevant because I can't change the system. So therefore, I think we all can change the system, but it's a question of ethical passion before the world.
My name is Tom Flanagan. My question is, do you think we're becoming immunized from the rhetoric of the top? Now, in saying that, if you're confronted with ambiguities at an international level, you can either believe it or seek to understand it, maybe convincing yourself you actually do. Or you can decide, it's being manipulated anyway. I don't necessarily have to listen to that source. I'm not sure when you talk about democracy in the populist sense, whether you mean the people who live in our communities are reading the Wall Street Journal, when in fact even the investigative journalism of the Standard Times has problems reaching the people at the level of the street. So the whole notion of the printed word and the power of those key words illustrates what can happen in certain dialogue when that dialogue does occur. But I think that democracy doesn't rain down upon the people. It rises up from within them. And so the real area where we should be looking at the language, I think, is the language that's coming up from the streets. The internet is presenting that to us.
Exactly.
Some of the poetry of the streets and of the raps is offensive to us because it makes us feel agitated, which is what it's intended to do.
Thank you very much. You're absolutely on the money. I focused this time. It's not one way. It should not be vertical. And we also see it in other ways. What's the percentage of people that vote? The form of alienation. There's a price to democracy. But if you look within the alienation, there are expressions that I think the new technology can capture. People now, for instance, like the rap world, for example, they were able to publish themselves and put themselves out there, without having to be controlled by the mega corporation that decides whether he's going to be an artist or not. But also in the community level, for instance, there are all kinds of organizations. Along, for instance, the Greens, in the environment. There's all kinds of things happening that we have to pay attention. All I'm trying to say is the traditional education that we have, the type of trained teachers, the race to the top, the meeting the standards for MCAS and so on and so forth, all work counter to what you're proposing. All work counter to what he is proposing. And I'm trying to say, let's embrace, just use this tool that had not been available, 34 years ago, to maximize the little space that we have to not only talk about democracy, but to practice democracy. Because we talk about democracy, but seldom do we practice democracy. And when democracy is practiced, we are even really, threatened by that practice. So if you pay attention to what, what's happening, for example, all over the world, in terms of denouncing, because you cannot announce unless you first denounce, but that denouncement, you see, the environment is the case in point, that denouncement has to create realignment with other forces, i.e., for instance, in the black community, with the rap artists and so on and so forth, with all kinds of organization that's happening with with Mexican Americans in the West and so on and so forth. That realignment or that coalescing of forces, you see, can be facilitated by technology, which will be much harder than without technology. I didn't mention because I had to cut. Freire is saying we need not be afraid of technology or be mystified by it. We need to confront it and appropriate it as a tool for liberation. And liberation, then, if we cannot liberate unless we have the conviction that we want to also engage in our own self-liberation to be able to practice democracy. And that's not easy because we all cut across with all kinds of contradictions. And we all tend to engage in little lies that to say, well, that's not the ethical posture. I can present an ethical posture and yet behave, not walk the talk. So the point is, yes, I agree with you. And that is why, for example, technology, you see, even when you do math, for example, I have a lot of friends that do critical math, that students don't have problems with mathematical concepts. For instance, a very good friend of mine, Michelle Fine, students that dropped out and flunked math and were dropouts in New York, she then did ethnography with them and followed them for 5 years, and she realized they were great mathematicians when they were pushing drugs. Because if they would really make a mistake, they lied on the line. Did you see my point? What I'm trying to say is that how you're talking about the bottom. If we believe that they can be great mathematicians, I'm not advocating selling drugs, okay? If they can become great mathematicians, I don't dismiss them and flunk them and they become dropouts, I don't invest in their education only later to pay $32,000 to have them jailed. So there's a cost to it. So then it's a horizontal, process through which that it's not just the bottom or the top. It's a dialogue between the bottom and the top, but the top needs to be unveiled. And I'm not so sure the educational tools that we have in this country or all over the world for that matter, is conducive or invite us to unveil. To unveil is dangerous.
The second part that I wanted to just mention is I think that the thinking student is trapped between hyperbole and humor, between a strong belief and an utter nonsense of belief. And I think that's a wonderful place to be.
Where does his belief lie, though?
I think it's dynamic, I think it moves, and I think it shifts from time to time. But being able to navigate the waters between hyperbole and humor, and we have our very strong left and right-wing talk show hosts, and then we have the emergence of Jon Stewart's Daily Show. It's the parody of media itself. I think that humor is a very powerful part of our educational experiences, and the more skills that we have to bring humor into our classroom, the more critical thinkers we're going to generate.
Well, let me give you an example. Look at the curriculum now. I mean, I met someone, I think she's left, she's here, yeah. For instance, a number of years ago, I did a proposal for UMass Dartmouth, for $1.5 million. We almost got it, we didn't, to include music and creative arts into the curriculum in the teaching of English as a second language, because I believe, and the research tend to support that the more artistic, the more you engage in content through art and music, the greater, if nothing else, your social filter, is lower than you achieve. Now, if I want to use humor, for example, as a content for my curriculum, look what's happening to art, to music, because I have to teach for them to pass, to extracurricular activities, even sport in schools. In Brockton Public Schools, 1/3 of the teachers, 480 teachers, were fired. You see? So basically, then the good ideas, are being suffocated by a seemingly democratic, educational policy. What I'm trying to say is, let us, because we are all intelligent, let us have the courage to say that Obama's educational policy is a third Bush term. There's no difference. In fact, it's more draconian, because it's a high stakes, closing down schools and firing teachers and basically sabotaging the what we fought for decades and decades and decades to have unions for representation, so on and so forth. I have my own problems with unions, but that's besides the point. The key is that what you're proposing, what I'm proposing, what he's proposing, these are tiny spaces. They don't represent the general, So what we find in the general, because we cannot produce what we claim that we are producing, then we end up with malaise. I think malaise is the worst position for teachers, is the worst position for citizens, it is the worst position for students to be at. Because I don't want to be in that position, then I have to do anything, including the maximization of technology, to see how I reinsert my humanity and the humanity of others, in the conversation. And that conversation can be enlarged through technology. It gets diminished through classrooms, traditional classrooms.
The reflection, we have teachers in the room and we have students in the room. There are teachers and PhD students.
I have a
reflection for on one of the things you said, which maybe for them to think about as well. Some of them are interested in technology. And the metaphor thinking out of the box is also a cliche for some. And what does that mean for using technology in education? What forms of what does that mean? If thinking out of the box is a cliche, what does that mean about your perception of technology in education? And talking about putting stuff in classrooms, putting new hardware, putting computers in, buying iPads and software, because that will fix everything. I mean, that to use your terminology, is surely an asymmetric semantic, because how do we know whether it will work or not? So what is the box, I suppose, is what we should be focusing on, rather than, if we're going to keep using this cliche, what is the box? And I put it there also into the minds of teachers and students here about their perception of technology.
Stephen, actually, I was going to ask a very similar question. Know that you use the terms deaf panel, but when you use the term technology, most perceive technology to be to dehumanize the classroom. Give me a tool. So by the time you share the conversation with teachers that technology can be used to liberate ideas, not to dehumanize the action, usually that class is over. Or teachers don't have access or don't have it. So again, playing on Stephen's question, how do you build on that? Where's the box?
Well, I agree with you. I think it was 15 or 20 years ago, I wrote a grant. Actually, it was the first grant in computer system instruction for Brockton Public Schools. The bilingual programs were computerized, before the general population had computers or computer labs. By the same token, I had done a grant at UMass Boston. When we had a computer lab, the dean's office had typewriters. But what I saw, visiting these schools, they would use for wood processing or collecting dust. You see, so in a sense, and then also technology can be, all things to all people is how you define it. What I'm proposing is that no term is innocent. All terms, run the risk of becoming empty slogans and cliches. So if I prepare teachers, in the dialogical, dialectical, type of approach that I'm suggesting right now, and everything's up for grab, including interrogating what's the box. I think the box will be the term to that's what I like your notion, co-actions and co-reactions. That we have to basically begin to believe as educators we are capable of creating the box, and that box may have very little to do with the box that's coming from Washington. Do you see what I'm saying? So, but then it takes courage in this environment that 480 teachers lost their jobs. You see, I tell teachers all the time, this is an anecdote, this is fine to do this in your class, in your social linguistics class, but how am I going to do it and keep my job? The key, what's the alternative? The alternative is to surrender and have the reproduction of the ugliness that we are seeing. Latinos in Boston public schools, the dropout rate in 7th and 6th grade, is about 65%. That is criminal in a democratic society. Criminal in a democratic society. But yet we have developed ways we have developed conviviality with that ugliness. What I'm asking us, I think, to technology is how, for instance, we create alternative ways that the 65 bright young women and men can be remotivated, the term they use, to understand about their learning and the motivation that keeps alive the epistological curiosity that moves all of us to want to learn. Because we have time constraint where we prepare teachers have to teach and so on and so forth. That's why it requires conviction, it requires, an ethical fortitude to really believe that you're making a difference. I tell teachers all the time, I can't do it. It's overwhelming. I cannot fight City Hall. I say, your presence already, being a critical person and thinking otherwise, is making a difference. Because think of the alternative. The alternative is you're going to reproduce more and more and more and more dropout rate. But I basically, as I did with this grant in technology, I hire people that would do that. That's not what I do, you see. Is that you create dialogue. Teachers begin to understand that they need not fear it. You see, they need not reduce it to a tool, as we do with methods, for example, you see, and they need to remain creative and create knowledge through it and with it, rather than allow it to control you. You see what I'm saying? So that is an a priori discussion before you even engage in the use of it. You see? But no question, the next generation, my grandchildren, will not be doing what we're doing here. You see? So therefore, I have to then, proact and prepare what's going to happen with respect to technology. What I did not talk about that I was going to talk about is not we have access and we have rewards with the technology that we have. But it has created a huge digital divide that billions of people are further reduced, to subsistence, living, without electricity, you can't be connected and wired, and so on and so forth. So the digital divide is also another issue that has to be engaged. So we cannot think that, technology is neutral. It's not neutral. It's not equally available to all. So therefore, those of us who are engaged in the critical discourse analysis, and this, critical dialogical teaching, we need to then expand the possibilities and see to it how we narrow the gap and widen the possibilities. But no question in my mind, if you do it critically, the potential, cannot be better. The potential cannot be better, in my view.
Fernando, let me be controversial here
It's okay.
or provocative. Yeah, I know. It's okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to use these words purposely since I know they will resonate a little bit here. Is it possible to be a critical theorist or engage in that critical discourse and still do it with scientific rigor?
Of course. Of course.
It's loaded, what I'm saying.
It's loaded. See,
because it has shockwave values.
To me, they're not mutually exclusive.
Okay.
What I do, if I go, for instance, I am working with a group of youth engaged in violence in Roxbury, Dorchester, in Brockton, and the highest rate of homicides among Cape Verdeans. Every week there's somebody here. So the discourse that I'm using here is not the discourse that I use in that population. So in becoming a critical person, I need to code switch. You see, but in code switching, I'm not going to sacrifice the principle of the rigor, and because ultimately I have a political project. You have a political project. Even those of you who say, I don't have a political project, I just teach, that is a political project. You see? So therefore then, the way I engage these youngsters, or the way I engage parents, most of whom are semi-literate, certainly illiterate in English, you see, it is precisely because of my critical theory that I'm able to be successful in accessing them, or them accessing me. But if I begin by doing what I'm doing here, obviously I totally lose them. So to answer your question, science, critical theory, or theory for that matter, you see, need not be mutually exclusive with practice or everyday language. Because it is the everyday language that some gets appropriated to become, the technological language. So what I need to understand is the nature of language, how language is used to create multiple realities, and how I interact with those realities, but I need to be prepared, and that preparation has to come from theoretical rigor. To end, there's no practice, no matter how you want to slice it, and how you want to deny it, that does not take a theory to truth theory. So in a sense is every single practice, has a theory that explains that practice. We may say, I don't want to know that, but that is the problem. So what I do then, for instance, even with these youngsters, you see, we meet every Friday, about 30, from parents to young involved in criminal acts, to kids doing very well in college, one's finishing a PhD, another one second year at medical school. So what I try to work with them in this process is for them to develop the critical language and also the conviction to know that they can know, not defeated by system, because the very survival and the street spots that they demonstrate shows they have the capacity to know and then to transcend, as the gentleman that left said, to transcend. Therefore, then, how do I use rigor of theory without theorizing to engage in a dialogue? Ultimately, is what he proposed, to engage in co-action, and the co-action is with the other. You cannot do co-action as an individual. You see, co-actions with the other. And the co-action is going to produce co-reaction. See? And I have to be prepared only through rigor that I can begin to have the tools, the theoretical tools, to engage the reaction. Because the reaction, I may not like it, or I may not even be able to, but I am willing to engage. Only dialogue will unveil new knowledge, and I'm not afraid of new knowledge. You know, that's how I do it.
One of the worst parts of my job is I have to stop the dialogue. And,
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for listening.
Brilliant ending to our series, and I remind you all that we do have a blog site, so you can continue the discussion amongst yourselves online from the Capital Century website. Thank you all, and have a great summer.
Thank you.